At 3:25 p.m. on Friday the 22nd of July 2011, a powerful car bomb detonated in the government quarter in Oslo, the capital of Norway. 8 people were killed and over 200 injured. However, this was only the start of the horror of that day. Less than 2 hours later, a man dressed like a police officer and calling himself Martin Nilsen travelled by ferry to the island of Utøya, 24 miles northwest of Oslo, where 600 students had gathered for a youth camp. Officer Nilsen stated that he was there to check on the teenagers due to the attack, and he was welcomed by staff. Little did they realise they were in mortal danger, and were face to face with Anders Breivik, an evil, depraved man, and the one responsible for the bombing that had killed 8 people, and he was far from done. Over the next 70 minutes, he would roam the island, engaging in a shooting spree that would claim 69 more lives. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Anders Breivik was born on the 13th of February 1979 in Oslo, the capital of Norway. His childhood was horrific, and it's here where we can see the damage that led to the dangerous, unhinged man he became. This is a really good example of generational abuse, i.e. one individual abusing their child and then them in turn victimising their offspring. He was the son of a woman called Wenche, who herself came from a background of abuse. Wenche's mother was paralysed during childbirth, and despite her daughter looking after her from when she was only a few years old, this was never enough. Wenche's mother blamed her daughter for her disability and openly stated that she hated her. As we'll get to, Wenche herself then passed this hatred down to her son, but upped the ante, acting in ways that would screw up any child. In the 1970s, Wenche met a man called Jens, a diplomat, and this led to the birth of Anders Breivik. And 6 months after he was born, the family moved to London after Jens was seconded to work at the Norwegian embassy. However, Wenche was unstable, and just 6 months later, she demanded a divorce and returned to Oslo with Breivik, who was a year old, and his half-sister Elizabeth. Wenche was not capable of raising the children. She gave them little comfort or protection, and abused them in ways which, with regards to Breivik especially, would destroy any chance he had of being a normal, fully functioning adult. By the age of 4, Breivik was known to the authorities because of significant concerns about his mental health and the impact his mother's abuse was having on him. At this time, 2 reports were filed expressing concerns about his welfare. One of these was written by a psychologist who noted Breivik's lack of emotion, his coldness, and the fact that he seemed to have a strange smile plastered across his face, which was totally at odds with the situation. In another report by Norway's National Centre for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, it documented serious concerns about Wenche's treatment of her own son. It described her as a, quote, woman with an extremely difficult upbringing, borderline personality disorder, and an all-encompassing, if only partially visible, depression, and that she sexualised the young Breivik, hit him, and frequently told him that she wished that he was dead. In terms of sexualised behaviour, it's reported that from the age of 4 years old, Wenche would sleep in the same bed as her son. This isn't necessarily unusual for a child of this age, but she would cuddle and caress him as though he was a partner and not her son. At the weekends, Wenche used to farm Breivik out to a couple she knew, and shockingly, she actually asked social workers, quote, if Anders could occasionally touch his weekend dad's penis. It was important for the boy's sexuality. Growing up, Breivik had no friends. He was a solitary little boy who enjoyed snapping the heads off roses, throwing stones through windows, killing ants. He also had pet rats, which he liked to poke with pencils. Breivik also took pleasure in bullying younger children, with someone who knew him at the time later stating, quote, if he could make someone cry, he would gloat, and his eyes would sparkle. Neighbours also disliked Breivik. He was arrogant and rude, and they kept their children away from him. As time went on, he had found out about his biological father's status as a diplomat. This gave him a form of escape. He began to believe that he was destined for better things, and that he was better than other people. He deserved to be the centre of attention, to have people falling over him. Escaping into his fantasy world enabled him to cope with his daily life of abuse and isolation. At the age of 13, Breivik began to build his identity by participating in a subculture of graffiti artists. He adopted the nickname Morg and fell in with a group which was almost entirely composed of Arab immigrants. However, Breivik tried to dominate and control members of the group. With him, every social interaction was a power struggle, and he was eventually ostracised because of his behaviour. Interestingly, Breivik's anti-Islamic sentiment seems to have begun around this point. He was fine with people from the Muslim faith until they personally rejected him. His graffiti career led to an arrest and a criminal record. This led to Breivik losing contact with his father Jens. There are conflicting accounts as to why. According to Breivik's mother, Jens cut his son off due to him having a criminal record, but according to Jens, it was his son who served the communication. After this point, Anders Breivik became more and more obsessed with being successful, bridging the gap between his reality and what he believed he deserved in his mind. In 1998, when Breivik was around 19 years old, he made some money on the stock market. This was only around £5,000, but he convinced himself that this was the way to become a millionaire, and he dropped out of commerce school. Over the years, Breivik set up various businesses to achieve his goal, some successful, others less so. One in particular was particularly profitable, an online venture selling fake certificates. You know, the ones where you pay for a diploma from an official sounding for fictitious university. This contributed almost entirely to the $150,000 to $200,000 that Breivik earned in 2003 when he was 24. This would be the money he would use to fund his eventual crimes. Anders Breivik also had aspirations of being a politician, and in his late teens he tried to join the right-wing Progress Party, with him being drawn to their anti-immigration rhetoric. He made friends with workers within the party and had dreams of running for elected office as a councillor, but he was a poor public speaker and was disliked by others, and he didn't even make the shortlist for consideration. He was then essentially cut off from the organisation. It's also reported that Anders Breivik was a failure with women, and so in 2004, aged 25, he began looking for a wife online. He paid money to obtain the contact information of a woman in Belarus who he paid to come to Oslo the next year. After spending just a few weeks with him, this woman left. She found him to be pretentious, arrogant, controlling and misogynistic. People who knew Breivik at the time later reported that this rejection was a turning point, and he became even more consumed with rage. It's important to stop here and consider who Anders Breivik was, a man rejected by the political elite that he desperately wanted to be a part of, Muslims and women. These would be his focus of hate, and in 2006, aged 27, he moved back in with his mother, and over the next 5 years would completely disconnect from reality, plan, and eventually carry out a terrorist attack, which would shock the world. At this point, it's important to mention Anders Breivik's manifesto, entitled 2083, A European Declaration of Independence, written between approximately 2007 and 2011. It's almost 1,500 pages long, and is so expansive that if you read 50 different articles on its rambling and often contradictory content, different parts will be mentioned. It's been labelled as an anti-Islamic document, but it's far more than that. It's a window into the grievances and mindset of an extremely disturbed and dangerous man. Half of it is plagiarised from the musings of others, including, for example, the writings of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. The half that Breivik wrote is unhinged. It contains cherry-picked facts and conspiracy theories to back up his racist narrative, and also includes a list of events throughout his life where he was apparently almost assaulted or robbed by Muslim men. Despite railing against Islam again and again, he wrote, quote, "I don't hate Muslims at all. I acknowledge that there are magnificent Muslim individuals in Europe. In fact, I've had several Muslim friends over the years, some of which I still respect. This does not mean, however, that I will accept an Islamic presence in Europe. Muslim individuals who do not assimilate 100% within 2020 will be deported as soon as we manage to seize power. The reference to we comes up again and again in the manifesto and brings us to two important traits of Breivik, him being both a pathological liar and a fantasist. The we he refers to is a Knights Templar organisation he claimed to be a senior figure of, having apparently attended the inaugural meeting of this super secret organisation in London in 2002. The Knights Templar were a French military order of the Catholic faith, active in the medieval period, who were involved in the Crusades, reconquering Jerusalem and its surrounding areas from Muslim rule. Breivik appeared fascinated with this order, and their emblem appears in his manifesto on multiple occasions. Breivik also gave himself various titles, including Knight Commander of the Knights Templar, Distinguished Destroyer of Cultural Marxism, and Commander of the Norwegian Anti-Communist Resistance Movement. He even took photos of himself in his pretend uniforms, posing like some sort of tin pot dictator. This, you'd be surprised to hear, imaginary organisation also had plans for women and children when they swept into power. Showing his misogyny, Breivik would force women back into domestic settings and bar them from higher education. He even suggested facilities where women would live, with their sole job being to produce Nordic children. Showing front and centre his pettiness and where his hatred of women ultimately stemmed from, he also bizarrely wrote about STDs that his mother Venka apparently had. However, whilst Breivik clearly hated Muslims and women, he was not going to target them directly. His main grievance was against the political elite, who he referred to as cultural Marxists, the ones who facilitated the Islamic invasion of Norway, who he stated promoted feminism, which distracted men, making the Islamification of Europe possible. With regards to being a pathological liar, Breivik's manifesto is a revisionist account of his life story, and he also makes wild claims about his interactions with prominent right-wing figures and organisations. So in the document, Breivik claims that he began planning his violent revolution since 2002, but prosecutors believe that he only began planning his attack in around 2009. It's also believed that many of the claims he made about being victimised by Muslim males during his life were fabricated. Also, as already mentioned, Breivik claimed to be part of a Knights Templar organisation which he joined in London in 2002. During this same year, he apparently also travelled to Liberia to meet a powerful, right-wing figure sympathetic to his cause. He also cited other visits to Baltic countries where he stated he would rub shoulders with various influential agitators. In London, he claimed he'd had a meeting with senior figures within the English Defence League. But the prosecution at his trial stated that through extensive investigation, they felt confident that much of Breivik's travel around this time was him pursuing leads which turned out to be scams linked to him setting up a blood diamond smuggling and money laundering operation. They even found some people who interacted with Breivik during this time who confirmed this was the nature of his visit. Some of his apparent meetings, they determined, given how long he was in the area or the country, he would not have had time to go to. With regards to his claims of being part of a Knights Templar organisation in London, there's no evidence this existed outside of Breivik's fantasies. In reality, Anders Breivik was a sad, unimportant man who, whilst living with his mother between 2007 and 2009, would sometimes spend up to 17 hours a day playing World of Warcraft online, completely cut off from the world. During this time, he was also devouring material about right-wing organisations as well as the writings of racist agitators. He made some YouTube videos promoting his twisted worldview and frequently posted on right-wing websites where he would get an audience, but in the real world, he bored the few remaining people he had in his life, spouting on and on about the pending Islamic invasion of Europe, and they too abandoned him. It's really important to cut through the noise in this case to whittle down Anders Breivik's 1500-page ramblings into a simpler summation of who he was and his motives. This rests on two key principles. He's a narcissist and a psychopath. This is not just my opinion, these are conclusions drawn by people who have reviewed the case and some of whom actually met the man and are more qualified than I am. Both of these points demonstrate front and centre that everything that Breivik did was about himself, for himself. During his life, he was rejected by Muslims, women, and the political elite, and it's no coincidence that these are the people that he wanted to kill, the ones who he felt had personally injured him. However, he spun this into some noble cause. He was trying to save the people of Norway and Europe from these evils, which is complete bollocks. Anders Breivik is a man incapable of caring for anyone else but himself. Instead, what he ultimately wanted was power. He wanted to initiate a civil war, sweep the government aside so he could take control, then enforce whatever policies he wanted, and essentially be some sort of dictator. From this position, he would punish whoever he wanted for whatever reason. He was a sad, pathetic man playing dress-up, who was desperate for relevance, desperate for the spotlight, and he would kill to achieve this. From around 2009, Anders Breivik began planning his terrorist atrocities. He drew up lists of targets, who he labelled as traitors, and again, his manifesto is awash with contradictory statements. He divided targets into 4 categories, labelled A to D. Category A contained 12 prominent politicians in the ruling Labour Party, including the Prime Minister at the time, Jens Stoltenberg. These were those he considered most directly involved in facilitating the Islamic invasion of Norway. Category B contained 4,500 people, including teachers, lecturers, radio commentators, and journalists, those with the most influence on the people and politicians. Category C contained 85,000 individuals in Norway, and the criteria for inclusion were that they facilitated Category A and B traitors, and this included youth organisations of major political parties. Category D had a mishmash of other professions, such as chiefs of police and fire chiefs, all of whom Breivik claimed had some sort of influence on the traitors in the categories above. Chillingly, he wrote in his manifesto, quote, "We have a mandate to execute Category A and B traitors. We do not really have the mandate to execute Category C traitors." Breivik made contradictory claims about how many people he wanted to kill in his manifesto and after his crimes. After the massacre, he stated, quote, "The operation was not to kill as many as possible, but to give a strong signal that cannot be misunderstood. As long as Labour follows its ideological line, continuing to deconstruct Norwegian culture and mass import Muslims, they must take responsibility for this treachery." But in his manifesto, he wrote, "Once you decide to strike, it's better to kill too many than not enough, or you risk reducing the desired ideological impact of the strike. Explain what you have done in an announcement distributed prior to operation, and make certain that everyone understands that we, the free people of Europe, are going to strike again and again." No target was off the table. He would kill men, women and children, and he wrote, quote, "If you are unwilling or incapable of killing women due to the principles of chivalry, you should probably steer away completely from the armed resistance movements and should probably consider creating yet another right-wing blog instead." Breivik wrote repeatedly about martyring himself for his cause. However, as we'll get to later, this was again a pile of bullshit, given how quickly he subsequently surrendered. Breivik considered himself far too important to die, but again, he wanted to give himself that air of gravitas. He was such a patriot, he would die for his country. In late 2009, Anders Breivik had decided he would perpetrate a bomb attack, followed by a mass shooting, and he scoured the internet, researching how to make a powerful explosive with products he could easily obtain. He decided on a fertilizer-based bomb similar to the one used by Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, and he spent the next year studying manuals and making a list of items he needed. Breivik wrote about every step of what he called his operation, giving each stage pathetic titles, such as the quote, "armour acquisition phase." Between late 2010 and early 2011, Anders Breivik applied for and legally obtained a Ruger Mini 14 assault rifle and a 9mm Glock 17 pistol. He was able to obtain these weapons because, aside from his brush with the law when he was a youth, he had no significant criminal record and was part of the Oslo Pistol Club. He also went on to obtain 450 rounds of ammunition, 300 for the rifle and 150 for the pistol. This included dum-dum bullets, which Breivik would later use, which were projectiles intended to expand and shatter upon impact, causing maximum damage. Breivik wrote in his manifesto that he played Call of Duty to refine his shooting skills, which is hilarious, given that this is an arcade shooter and firing a real weapon is nothing like what you experience in this game. Also during this time, Breivik purchased components he would need for his bomb, including sodium nitrate, aluminium powder, fertilizer and fuses, which he obtained from Polish, Norwegian and Chinese suppliers, as well as local drugstores and eBay, and he began experimenting, but he needed cover to obtain the amount of chemicals he needed without suspicion, as well as a place to test his efforts. And so, on the 10th of April 2011, 3 months before the attack, Anders Breivik went to a 23-acre farm in Hedmark, around 80 miles north of Oslo. This gave him the space to test his explosives and refine his methods. Presenting himself as a farmer, he was able to obtain large quantities of chemicals he needed, and on the 2nd of May 2011, he took delivery of 3,000 kilos of fertilizer. In these final stages, Breivik needed to decide on his targets. He had various plans, including killing prominent figures in Norway, including the royal family, and then going on a shooting spree in shopping centres. But eventually, he decided to detonate a bomb in the government quarter of Oslo, and then travel to the 26-acre island of Utøya, which lies 24 miles northwest of Oslo city centre, where he would engage in a shooting spree. The island is owned by the Workers' Youth League, a youth group associated with the Labour Party, and where each year an annual summer camp was held, and the 600 attendees at the 2011 event were its targets. These individuals, most of them children, according to Breivik, were Category C traitors, individuals who, simply because they shared the same political beliefs as the ruling party, encouraged and facilitated their agenda, and therefore they deserved to be executed. In the weeks prior to the attack, Anders Breivik bought a fake police uniform, an ID badge, the name of Martin Nilsen, and he also rented 2 vans. On Thursday the 21st of July 2011, 24 hours before the attacks, Breivik loaded the larger van with his 900-kilo bomb and drove it into Oslo city centre, parking it close to his target. He left it with a sign in the window stating "Sorry, Sewage Works," placed in the window in case anyone became suspicious of the smell of chemicals. He then went back, began checking his guns and collecting his ammo, readying himself for the massacre the next day. It would later transpire that Anders Breivik intended to send his manifesto at 3 a.m. on Friday the 22nd of July 2011, detonate the bomb at 10 a.m. and be on Utøya Island at 11 a.m. in order to execute a prominent Norwegian politician who was due to give a talk to the members of the youth group. However, he had problems with his IT, and so his plan was delayed, and this inevitably saved some lives, as we'll get to momentarily. Eventually, at 2:09 p.m, he sent his rambling manifesto to 1,002 email addresses, including Norwegian politicians and journalists, names which he collected over the years. Breivik then packed his second rental van with his tools of murder, including his Ruger Mini 14 assault rifle and his 9mm Glock 17 pistol, along with 450 rounds of ammunition. Breivik also loaded his fake police uniform, his fake ID in the name of Officer Martin Nilsen, body armour and a helmet. He also took gallons of fuel with him, intending to set fire to the buildings on the island of Utøya, but was unable to do this because he lost his lighter during the attack. Breivik then drove his second van into Oslo town centre, parked up, changed into his police uniform, and got behind the wheel of the van containing the bomb that he'd already placed close to his target the day before. He then drove the van towards his target, a 17-storey building in the heart of the government quarter, which housed the office of the Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, who was not present at the time. Breivik's movements were captured on CCTV as he parked up at 3:17 p.m. He then went into the back of the van, lit the 7-minute fuse on the bomb, before climbing out of the driver's door and walking away, pistol in hand. This was noticed by a man called Andreas Olsen, whose information could have potentially stopped the horror that came next. He saw Breivik and thought his behaviour was very strange, including questioning why this police officer had a gun in his hand. He became even more suspicious when he saw this man get into a grey van and then drive away at speed, pulling away into oncoming traffic. He wrote down the colour, make, model and licence plate of the vehicle, a grey Fiat Doblo, registration VH24605. Guards on the ground and CCTV controllers were instantly suspicious of the van, but were initially thrown because the man driving it appeared to be a police officer. A CCTV operator was zooming in on the van, trying to work out if it should have been there, when at 3:25 p.m. the bomb detonated, with a force equivalent of between 400 and 700 kilos of TNT. The blast caused massive devastation, blowing out windows of office blocks, damaging vehicles, and sending shrapnel flying through the air. 6 women and 2 men were killed in the explosion. At least 2 of the victims were walking directly behind the van when it exploded. As well as the dead, at least 209 people were injured, including 12 seriously. The death toll would have been much higher, but many people had already left for the day, as it's acceptable in Norway, especially for office workers, for them to leave work at 2 p.m. on a Friday. If Breivik had detonated the bomb in the morning as he intended, the death toll would have likely been in the hundreds. The first police car reached the scene 3 minutes after the explosion, and 10 ambulances were dispatched. The phone networks were pushed to breaking point, with concerned citizens trying to track down their loved ones. Chaos and confusion descended on Oslo, and this, coupled with the incompetence and brazen insubordination of some police officers, meant that an opportunity to stop Breivik in his tracks was lost. He was, in the moments immediately after the bomb detonated, sat in the van with the radio on, listening to the chaos. He was on his way to Utøya, around 24 miles northwest of Oslo, to catch the ferry to the island of Utøya. At 3:34 p.m, 9 minutes after the bomb blast, Anders Olsen, who had seen Breivik, had taken down the plate of his second vehicle, called the police. He described a man acting strangely, who was apparently a police officer, who had then gotten into a grey Fiat Doblo van and driven away. Andreas provided all the details of the van, including the license plate. There was mention of a man holding a gun as he walked down the street, which led the operator to believe this was a significant and crucial tip, and this was written on a yellow post-it note and thrust in front of a senior officer in the Joint Operations Centre, which was a hive of activity. The operator later stated that she caught the eye of the officer in charge, who was on the phone, so she couldn't speak to him, but believed, from the look that she gave him, he understood that the note was important. She then left. However, the note sat unactioned for 20 minutes until another operator noticed it and called Anders Olsen back to get further information. This call ended at 4:02 p.m, almost half an hour after the first call had come in. 60 seconds after the call with Andreas ended, Breivik drove past the police station in a town called Sandvika, just 10 miles into his 24-mile journey. If officers had been looking out of the window, they would have seen him drive past. At 4:05 p.m, 2 minutes later, the emergency response squad at the police station were given full details of the van and a description of the driver. They were told to track it down and stop it at all costs. The chief of operations had 3 patrol cars at her disposal, and she called the closest one, which was on its way to pick up a prisoner from a local prison to take him back to Oslo. She ordered them to stop what they were doing and start scouring the roads looking for the van. However, the 2 officers ignored her and made their prisoner pick up. The second patrol car, which was further away, had also ignored their orders to search for the van, and instead stayed with an individual they were dealing with, who was having a psychiatric assessment. I have no idea what happened to these officers. At the very least, I hope they were fired, as their insubordination allowed a terrorist, a mass murderer, to slip through the net, and almost 70 more people would die as a result. It wasn't entirely the fault of these officers. Norway had no process in place to deal with an event like this, and chaos reigned in the aftermath, and a combination of these factors meant that Anders Breivik was able to complete his journey unencumbered, and he arrived at the ferry at 4:55 p.m. Less than half an hour later, Anders Breivik would carry out what is still, to this day, the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in history. During this section, I'm going to use clips from the Netflix film 22nd of July, words of survivors, as well as those of Anders Breivik, to fully illustrate the horror of the Utøya massacre. So after arriving at Utøya at 4:55 p.m, Breivik, presenting himself as Officer Martin Nilsen, spoke to a ferryman asking for passage to Utøya. The ferry was brought over and Breivik boarded, carrying a black suitcase. Inside was his ammunition, the fuel he was planning to use to set fire to the buildings on the island. At 5:17 p.m, the ferry arrived. All 600 attendees of the youth camp were in shock as a result of the bomb blast that had just rocked Oslo, and so the presence of a police officer was initially welcomed. Breivik was even helped to carry his suitcase off the ferry. He then asked for the guard at the head of the camp to come out and speak to him. Anders Breivik later stated that at this point there were, quote, 100 voices telling him not to go through with the massacre. But after a brief moment of hesitation, he took his pistol from his hip and shot both the guard and the head of the camp in the head, killing them instantly. These shots, fired at 5:21 p.m, signified the start of 70 minutes of horror. Initially everyone froze, not knowing what was going on. Then panic ensued as Breivik strode towards them, emerging from the woods towards the area where tents were set up, shooting at anything that moved. I want to play a short clip from Adrian Procon, a survivor of the massacre, describing the horror in those few seconds when everyone realised that a madman was there to kill them.
I could see people running and him shooting, and I could see 3 people fall just right here. It was like nothing, not even a single leaf or straw grass moved. Everything just stood completely still. And at the same time that girl hit the ground, it seemed like the ground just lifted itself up and started running away. And that was all the people running between the strings and the tents and the things lying around, chairs. It was like an obstacle course. This was an obstacle course where if you fall, you would die, actually.
Anders Breivik then began moving around the island, cutting down screaming youngsters. At one point, he entered a cafe and found a group of people hiding. He later stated, quote, "Some of them are completely paralysed. They cannot run. 2 people were curled up. People were begging for their lives. I just shot them in the head." Many people describe Breivik as being completely emotionless, only breaking this when he shouted various phrases, including, quote, "You will die today, Marxists, liberals, members of the elite." Breivik used the confusion and the fact that he addresses a police officer to his full advantage. If he saw anyone hiding, he would shout out that they were safe as the police were here. When they emerged, quote, "I shot towards many of them, aiming at their heads." One example of this was when he found a group hiding in and around a cinder block hut known as the Pump House. Breivik shouted that the gunman had been captured and the police were here. When the youngsters emerged, Breivik opened fire, killing 14 of them. Playing dead did not save victims of the massacre, as Breivik calmly executed those showing signs of life. Many of the youths ran to the outskirts of the island, either to swim for their lives or to hide in rocky alcoves, praying they wouldn't be seen by Breivik, but many were spotted and picked off by him. One of the people who decided to swim was 18-year-old Emma Martinovich. She later described getting into the water, quote, "It was cold, I felt the chill in my bones, but focused on keeping my head above water. Behind me, some of the others were starting to panic, so I shouted to them, 'Keep your head above water, get away from land, breathe.' She then turned back and saw the gunman. It looked as if he was aiming at us. Poff, one of the other swimmers was shot. I saw the blood stream out, so I started to swim even faster. Then I turned on my back again and saw he was aiming at those who still hadn't started swimming from land yet." I saw one of my friends about to leap into the water, but in a second, he was shot. Even at a distance, I could see and hear the 2 shots, straight to the head. I saw his head explode. I saw how he was split apart. Panic spread like wildfire amongst those on land. I wanted to be among them, urging them to get away, by land or water. One thing that Emma remembered distinctly was, quote, the laughter of the bastards as he shot, and his shout to us, "You won't get away." A boat had been dispatched by locals, which raced to pluck people out of the water, but many of those who began to swim had to turn back, realising the water was too cold and the distance too great. When they returned to the island, Breivik was waiting for them. Many of them were executed as they scrambled to the shore. At least one of the victims drowned trying to escape, and another died after falling from a cliff, trying to get away. At 6:01 p.m, 40 minutes into his killing spree, Breivik made the first of 9 calls to the police, apparently looking to surrender. Only 3 of these connected.
Utøya, ønsker å overgi meg. Ok. Så hvilket nummer ringer du fra? Jeg ringer fra mobil. Du ringer fra din mobil? Ja. Det ikke min mobil, en annen. Ja, hva heter du?
Breivik later claimed that he wanted to surrender because, quote, the operation was completed and he couldn't find any other targets. Whilst Anders Breivik was indeed intending to surrender, he had no intention of stopping his rampage and would continue killing for another 30 minutes. Adrian Procon was one of the people who clambered to the coast where he was shot, as he later recalls in this clip, which also shows footage from a news helicopter that had raced to the scene and captured Breivik in the midst of his spree.
And the first shot was so loud. Before I even could open my eyes, I felt something warm next to my head. It felt like my head exploded. Now I was convinced I was dead.
The Norwegian police's response was completely bungled. They didn't have helicopters suitable for transporting groups of police for an airdrop. Local police arrived at Utøya less than 30 minutes after the first shots were fired, but they had no way of getting to the island. The ferry was not on the right side of the water. Members of Delta, the police tactical unit, arrived and tried to navigate the lake in a rigid-hulled inflatable boat, which quickly took on water and the engine stopped. They had to eventually commandeer a civilian craft to take them to the island. It wasn't until 6:30 p.m, over an hour after the massacre started, that they reached the island, and they could still hear gunshots being fired, each one likely representing another victim. The team then moved through the island and were anticipating getting into a firefight with the perpetrator, but what came next surprised them. One of the team later stated, quote, "The terrain was very difficult, and it was hard to get clear visibility, but as we were running, we came into a clearing, and suddenly, in front of us, there he was, the gunman, with his hands above his head." Anders Breivik's weapons were found on the ground over 10 metres away from him when he surrendered to the police. He didn't offer any resistance, and this is the only reason why he wasn't killed on the spot. All of his bravado about sacrificing himself for his cause was bullshit. Breivik's whole intention was to surrender. He wanted the limelight, to bask in what he'd done. He was then interrogated in the camp's wooden headquarters. The police needed to work out if he'd acted alone or whether there were more terrorists they needed to hunt down. He sat smoking in a chair, refusing to answer the police's questions. Instead, everything was about him. Breivik had a tiny cut on his finger, and he began whining, saying, quote, "Look, I'm hurt. This will have to be bandaged up. I've lost a lot of blood. I can't afford to lose too much blood. I've lost half a litre already." Whilst he was having plasters applied to his 5mm cut, Breivik began musing about how he got injured. He told the police officers that he believed it had been when a piece of skull from one of his victims hit him. The callousness and utter disconnect from reality of Breivik was on full display but things got worse as the interrogation reached its end, as he was told to strip and was photographed. One of the officers present later stated, quote, "Finally, he was standing there in a room of uniformed men in his underpants. He started posing, trying to look macho. He looked into the camera and thrust out his chest. His hands were clasped at one hip, while he held his body taut in a classic bodybuilding pose to make his muscles bulge as much as possible. So this lunatic was preening and posing to the camera, whilst the dead and dying were lying on the ground, which was soaked with blood. The killing spree resulted in the deaths of 69 people, 67 of whom had been shot dead, one had drowned, one had fallen to their death. The youngest victims were two 14-year-olds, and the eldest was 51. Most of the dead were aged just 17 or 18 years old. This brought the total number of people murdered by Anders Breivik across both atrocities to 77. 32 people were injured on the island of Utøya, and this brought the total number of wounded on that day to approximately 240. Many of those who survived had to endure painful surgeries, and some lost one or multiple limbs. All of this devastation caused by one deranged man with a god complex. Anders Breivik was charged with terrorism and premeditated murder for killing 77 people. He was held in isolation whilst awaiting trial. Soon after his arrest, Breivik was assessed by a forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed him as being a paranoid schizophrenic, i.e. he was seriously mentally unwell and he was experiencing delusions. The psychiatrist stated that this condition had developed over a long period of time and that at the time of his crimes, Breivik was psychotic, i.e. completely disconnected from reality. Breivik was indignant with this diagnosis, and the court itself asked for a second opinion, and the second psychiatrist stated that whilst Anders Breivik had underlying personality disorders, he was legally sane, i.e. he knew exactly what he was doing when he ended the lives of almost 80 people. The trial of Anders Breivik began on Monday the 16th of April 2012 in Oslo District Court. He was brought in wearing a dark suit and smiling broadly. When his handcuffs were taken off, he gave a closed fist salute. He later told the lead judge, quote, "I do not recognise the Norwegian courts. You have received your mandate from political parties which support multiculturalism." After the charges were read, he stated, "I acknowledge the acts, but not criminal guilt. I claim I was doing it in self-defence." In his hour-long rambling opening speech, Breivik compared his actions to America's decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, horror to prevent even worse horror. He also rambled on about the political elite who had apparently encouraged the Islamic invasion of Europe, with him stating, quote, "If what I say is true, how can what I have done been illegal? How can it be illegal to show armed resistance to these groups? I did this out of goodness, not evil. I acted in self-defence on behalf of my people, my city, my country. I acted in the principle of necessity for my country, so I asked to be acquitted." These statements epitomise the true evil of Breivik, a man who not only felt completely justified in killing men, women and children, he was proud of what he'd done, and in his twisted mind felt he should be applauded, not condemned. The trial lasted 6 days, and during this entire time, Anders Breivik didn't show any remorse or regret for what he'd done. Instead, he often sat at the defence table, grinning like an idiot. In one bizarre moment, when a video that he made for YouTube was played in court, he sat there in floods of tears, no doubt moved to emotion by the greatness of his own production. At the end of the trial, Breivik was found guilty of all charges, and on Friday the 24th of August 2012, he was back in court to learn his fate. For the murder of 77 people, Anders Breivik was sentenced to preventative detention for a period of 21 years, the maximum penalty in Norway, with a minimum non-parole period of 10 years, again, the longest minimum sentence available. However, this is a preventative sentence, so Breivik can be held in custody indefinitely if he's deemed to be a risk to society. There's no way that he'll ever be released. But he is eligible to apply for parole, and the courts have to go through the rigmarole of these hearings. This included in 2022, when he'd served the minimum 10-year sentence, as shown by this clip. see if he can spot any red flags.
Unapologetic, Anders Breivik arrived in a makeshift court inside Skien prison, demonstrating a continued belief in the far-right ideology that inspired his crimes. The 42-year-old is asking for release on probation as the minimum period of his sentence is up.
Today I renounce all forms of violence and terror, along with the objectives in the manifesto, and I give you my word of honour that this is behind me forever. But this doesn't mean that I won't keep fighting for a national socialist takeover of Norway and the West.
So word to the wise, if you want to get parole, then starting with a Nazi salute will likely put you on the back foot. Just a thought. Surprise, surprise, Breivik's bid for freedom was rejected. He made his most recent parole application in November 2024, telling the court that the atrocities that he committed were, quote, necessary. Again, his bid for freedom was rejected. Breivik stated he would appeal the decision. He can apply for parole every 12 months, so I imagine he'll be back in court year in, year out, wasting taxpayer money just to preen and pose. I think that most of this is about attention, having court hearings, being in the news, but I believe that part of Breivik, due to him being so disconnected from reality, thinks that he has served his time for his crimes and that it's only a matter of time until he's released back into the world. As well as his applications for parole, Anders Breivik has repeatedly appealed against his conditions in prison, with him being held in solitary confinement since the day of his arrest. The most recent of these applications was heard and rejected in February 2024. It was revealed at this hearing that Anders Breivik is currently incarcerated at the high-security Ringerike prison, where he lives in a two-storey complex with a kitchen, dining room, TV room with an Xbox, several armchairs, and black and white pictures of the Eiffel Tower on the wall. He also has a fitness room with weights, a treadmill, and a rowing machine, and 3 parakeets flying around the complex. He does, however, have no contact with any other prisoners due to fear that he may kill them or potentially radicalise them. I mean, this fucking prick, he killed 77 people and is moaning about his quality of life when he robbed so many of any chance of a future. He lives in relative luxury compared to what his conditions would be like in places like the UK or the US. Regardless, Anders Breivik is where he belongs, locked away. He's a very dangerous, deranged and evil man, and I look forward to the day when I read that he has died and will hopefully begin an eternity rotting in hell. I imagine that almost all of you had heard about the 2011 Norway attacks and the name of the perpetrator, Anders Breivik, but I genuinely didn't know many of the details, and it's been horrifying, also extremely interesting, to find out more about what happened on that horrific day, but also the monster responsible. I previously used the term pure narcissist to refer to a previous subject of one of my cases, Nicholas Rossi, aka Arthur Knight, but I think that Breivik takes this title hands down. Again, this is not a clinical term, just a phrase I've come up with in order to highlight individuals who are so self-absorbed, so disinterested in anyone else but themselves that I think they need a specific label. As one commentator in a New Yorker article stated, Anders Breivik, quote, wanted to be seen, that is what drove him, nothing else. Look at me, look at me, look at me. He is a person filled to the brim with himself. At his core, Breivik was a deeply disturbed, damaged man. He was raised by an abusive mother who potentially sexually assaulted him or allowed others to do so, who told him that he was worthless and gave him no love and comfort. In order to cope with this, he disappeared into his fantasy world, centered around his father, the diplomat. This gave him a little glimmer of hope. He was special, meant for better things. This could not be his life. Unlike all narcissists, he created a shell around his fragile ego. He convinced himself that he was special, better than everyone else, entitled to the best of everything. This came across in his demeanour, his arrogance, his cruelty. In order to make himself feel powerful, he bullied other children and also tormented his pets. But he was a fragile child and then a man who couldn't suffer rejection or anyone not acknowledging how great he was. Each narcissistic injury he remembered, and he would plot his revenge. This included against the political elite and Muslim teenagers who rejected him. He already had a hatred of women due to his mother, but this was galvanised when he was rejected by potential partners. Of course, these specific groups that rejected him were folded into his deranged manifesto, but as he became more and more irrelevant, the stories he wove and the importance he assigned to his own personal grievances took on a new element. He was not a sad little man, he was a patriot, a freedom fighter, one of the Knights Templar. He was doing this for Norway, for the world. He then spun a ridiculous story of him travelling around the world, attending secret meetings, no doubt where everyone was fawning at his greatness. As I said earlier, Anders Breivik is both a narcissist and a psychopath, which makes his claims that he did what he did for anyone but himself ridiculous. He has no regard for human life. If he had caused a civil war in Norway, he would have used this to attain ultimate power and then persecute anyone he disliked or disagreed with. He was a tin pot dictator in the making, who would have strutted around in military uniforms, adorned with medals that he didn't earn, with titles as long as your arm, which he'd given to himself. His actions were to strike back against those he felt had wronged him, and to gain attention, and he would happily shoot children in the head to do this. He has no remorse, no regret for anything he's done. As to his bullshit claims of martyring himself, the plan was always to surrender, to continue the pantomime, to strut and smirk in court, whilst everyone basked in his greatness. There is no way that Anders Breivik will be released from prison, but even if there was an opportunity, thankfully he's his own worst enemy. His pathological need for attention, his unwillingness to acknowledge any fault in himself, will always be his downfall. He will never admit what he did was wrong, as this would mean acknowledging what he is, a monster, a mass murderer, and his fragile ego cannot handle this. He needs to remain a legend in his own mind, and I'm sure this is what he'll hold on to until his dying day. So, what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, and you can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.